Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about people who experienced huge changes to their lives. But they then found out that sometimes you just can't escape your past. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and systematically remove 1 digit from every single phone number that's saved in their contacts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of March 27th, 1907, a 45-year-old woman named Mary Watson was cleaning her parlor in the small town of Wadesville, Indiana. She was standing on a step stool, and she was using a broom to sweep the cobwebs and the dust off the ceiling, and as she was doing that, she began to feel lightheaded. So immediately, she put the broom down and she climbed off the step stool, and she thought, she hadn't really had much to eat that morning, and so that must be why she was feeling dizzy. And so while she stood on the flat ground, waiting for this to pass, she reached over and she grabbed a biscuit and some coffee from the tray that her husband Zach had left for her before he had left for work that morning. Now, she didn't plan to rest here for too long, basically just until the dizziness cleared, and then she would get back to work because she had a lot of work still to do. She really wanted to have the house clean before Zach got back home. So Mary and Zach had only recently gotten married, just 5 months ago. And so they were still very much in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, where basically, everything was so great. They loved each other so much. Mary felt like she'd landed the perfect man. Zach he was smart, he was charming, and he had a good job running the local post office. And most of the time, he was pretty upbeat and had a good sense of humor. However, just a few weeks ago, right around the beginning of March, that had changed. Zach had suddenly become really moody and quite distant. And when he got home from work, instead of chatting with Mary like he used to, he would go straight to his study and just sit alone for hours. But Mary didn't have to ask him what was bothering him because she knew. She knew that this time of the year was really hard for her husband because he had actually been married previously, twice actually, and both of his previous wives had died in March. And in fact, they died just 1 year apart from each other. So this month was just like a very tragic time for him. And these deaths were not like in the distant past. They were kind of recent. His first wife had died 2 years ago in March of 1905, and then his second wife had followed in March of 1906. So almost exactly 1 year ago to today's date, March of 1907. Now, Mary did think this was tragic, a horrible coincidence, But Mary's sisters, they found this pattern to be very suspicious, and they'd even tried to talk Mary out of going through with the wedding, asking if she really wanted to marry a man whose wives kept dropping dead. But Mary had brushed off their concerns because really deep down, she trusted him. She knew ultimately he really was a victim here of just terrible, unlucky coincidence. Now, the coroner had officially ruled that both of Zach's wives had died of sudden illnesses. And to some degree, to Mary's sisters, that only added to the suspicion. But to Mary, it seemed like it just sort of got rid of the suspicion of anything. How could Zach have had anything to do with his wives suddenly getting sick? It just didn't make any sense to her. However, despite firmly standing behind her husband here, what Mary did struggle with when it came to her husband's previous wives and this whole thing was that Zach clearly was still grieving his other wives. Like they were clearly on his mind, as they should be, and she understood that, but that was tough. But Mary had nowhere to put these feelings. She couldn't be mad at him. His first wife, Sarah, they had been together for 34 years before she died. That was a whole life before Mary, and she knew that. And then, the second wife, it is what it is. It was a short marriage, but she couldn't blame him for the situation she was in. It was just difficult. But sometimes, despite logically understanding the situation that she was in and doing her best to sort of emotionally contain it, Mary sometimes got this feeling that it was almost like she was living in somebody else's house, or like she was living in somebody else's life, specifically Sarah's life. Sarah was Zach's first wife. They'd been together for those 34 years. I mean, ever since Mary had moved into this home with Zach, which is where Sarah had lived for all those years, Mary had been hesitant to do anything, to rearrange furniture or change the ugly green wallpaper that she really wanted to change in the parlor here, or get rid of any of the old-fashioned decor. It's like she knew that, that would be sort of bad for Zach potentially, that he would see that as, disrespectful to his first wife and to some degree his second wife. Mary just sort of felt like she was the third wheel in a sense. But as Mary stood in that parlor with the ugly green wallpaper, waiting for her headache and her dizziness to clear from when she had been cleaning the ceiling here, she's having those thoughts about how difficult her life was, but she reminded herself that, despite it all, she was Zach's wife now. No matter how she felt about it, those were the facts. She was his wife and he was her husband. And so no matter how she felt about this house, the house was primarily her responsibility, and she was going to make sure that it was clean. So after taking a final sip of coffee, Mary grabbed her broom and she was about to climb back up on the stepladder to get back to cleaning the ceiling when she was hit with another really intense wave of nausea. She had to grab a table just to steady herself, and as she does, she feels this really intense, sharp cramp in her stomach that caused her to double over, and then before long, she collapsed to the ground right onto her knees, just writhing in pain. A few hours later, Mary's sister, Nancy, was standing outside of Mary and Zach's house, just absolutely breaking down, crying, just totally upset. And as she did this, she was watching as the undertaker loaded Mary's body into a horse-drawn wagon. Nancy couldn't believe how quickly this had all happened. I mean, she and Mary talked all the time. And that morning, Mary had sent a young neighbor over to Nancy's place to tell her that Mary said she was feeling sick and needed some help. But by the time Nancy arrived, it was too late. Mary was vomiting and she was convulsing, and by around 1 p.m., she was dead. And this was exactly what Nancy had feared would happen when Mary and Zach got married. She just hadn't imagined that it could possibly happen so quickly. So now, as the undertaker drove off with her sister's body inside, Nancy's gaze shifted to Zach, who was over on the porch talking to the town doctor. Zach had now lost 3 wives in 3 years, all in the same month too, like exactly a year apart. And Nancy, at this point, she was sure that he had to be responsible. Like, how else could this ever be possible unless he was doing something to these women? And Nancy, she was determined to prove it. The next day, Nancy and the rest of Mary's family walked with the town doctor and with Zach through Zach and Mary's home, looking for clues about what could have killed Mary. And all of them were just peppering Zach with questions about what each of his wives had been doing right before they died. And so far, Nancy wasn't hearing anything that made her think that Zach was innocent. According to Zach, there was zero connection between the 3 deaths, except for the fact that they all happened in March. One of the wives had eaten a full breakfast before she died, and one had eaten nothing before she died. And Mary had actually only had some coffee and apparently a couple of bites of biscuits before she died. Zach also said that his first and second wives had been complaining of feeling sick for about 2 days before they ultimately succumbed and died. But Mary had been basically perfectly fine right up until she just suddenly died. Now, to Nancy, it seemed like Zach was trying way too hard to make it all just seem sort of random. She just didn't believe that there was literally no connection between all 3 deaths. How could that be? This is way too coincidental. And so Nancy was very happy to see that the town doctor was systematically gathering up different things from inside the house as they walked around, like silverware and various food items, basically anything that Mary might have put in her mouth or maybe touched, because he planned to get them all tested to see if maybe there was poison involved here. And so Nancy was glad that, Zach's saying one thing, but we're going to actually test some stuff and see if that's really true. And so Nancy began following the doctor as he was scooping up all these different things, and eventually they found their way into the parlor, which is where Mary ultimately died. And when they were in the parlor, the doctor just abruptly stopped, and then he pointed to something in the middle of the room. And then he turned and looked at Nancy and the rest of the group who were also coming in, and he just said, "I know what happened." And Nancy was so caught off guard by this. I mean, she figured this was going to take some time to figure out this mystery. She looked past the doctor into the parlor to where he had been pointing, and she expected to see some kind of obvious clue, but to her confusion, there was just a step stool and then a dusty old broom. That was all he pointed to, and she couldn't understand what he was talking about. So it would turn out that the three wives actually did have something in common when it came to their untimely deaths. So in the early 1900s, the month of March was the time for spring cleaning. And spring cleaning was what all of Zach's wives had been doing right before they died. Specifically, all of them had been cleaning the parlor, which had that ugly green wallpaper in it. But this wallpaper was not just ugly. It also contained a toxic substance known as arsenic. And when Mary and both of Zach's other wives dusted with the broom, it kicked up a cloud of deadly particles that they all inhaled. And so the town doctor had the wallpaper tested, and he would confirm that all three women had died of poisoning. Except the culprit was not Zach, it was the wallpaper. A few weeks later, Zach would have that wallpaper torn down, and then he married a fourth wife, but this time, she outlived him. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS debt for a real solution. PDS debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment, and savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. One morning in the spring of 1885, a young man named Henry Ziegland was leading a horse around his family's farm in Driner Township, Minnesota. The horse was recovering from a minor hoof injury, and now Henry was taking it for a walk to give it some light exercise and get a sense of how it was actually doing. And Henry was in an unusually good mood. He was enjoying the warm breeze, and he also just had this great feeling that he had his whole life ahead of him, which was really not a feeling that Henry was used to at all. So until recently, Henry had been engaged to a young woman named Maisie Tickner. Henry had started talking to her 5 years ago when they were both in their early 20s, and their initial romance had been great. They'd fallen for each other really quickly, and they'd actually moved in together really quickly, even though back then that kind of thing was definitely frowned upon unless you were married, but they're like, don't worry, we're gonna get married, it's okay. And so people were like, I don't know, but they were like, it doesn't matter. We're gonna get married, it's all gonna be good. Except the wedding had never really materialized. Now, Henry hadn't planned to break his promise to Maisie, but first he'd just been busy with his farming. And then Maisie had taken a new teaching job. And since they were already living together, Henry hadn't seen what the difference would be if they got married anyways. It just sort of seemed like, what's the big rush? But as the years went by and they continued not to get married, Maisie began pestering Henry more and more about just setting a date so they could finally get married and stop living this sort of scandalous life. And for Henry, he understood why she was doing this, but the more she asked, the more he sort of began to think, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to marry her. I don't know if this is a good idea at all for me. And then finally, just a few days ago, Maisie had sat Henry down in their kitchen and had given him an ultimatum. He could either marry her like he had promised, or they were done. And in that moment, Henry had sort of realized that ending this relationship was exactly what he wanted. So that day, he was like, okay, I guess we're done. He packed his things, and he moved into his family's farm. And Maisie had been sort of caught off guard by this, because as much as she's the one positioning the ultimatum, acting like she's prepared to walk away too, in reality, she wasn't. She really wanted to get married. That's what she wanted. She was just trying to force him to finally do it. And so when he was like, okay, bye, we're over, it's like she tried to stop him, but then she began saying like, you're ruining my life. Like, you're ruining my life, not your life, my life. So a broken engagement, after having lived together and shared the same bed for years at a time, and then never getting married, that was a very bad situation for both parties, but at the time, it was far worse, socially, let's say, for the woman than it was for the man. And so in Maisie's mind, and I'm sure Henry understood this too, but for Maisie, it's sort of like, Henry, if you walk out on me right now, no one's going to want me. Like, my life will be ruined, and yours won't be. Like, you're the guy. You're going to be able to go on and get married, and I won't be able to. But Henry didn't really care, and he left. And now, after a few days since the separation, Henry, despite logically knowing that he clearly had put Maisie in a very bad position, he knew that, but he knew internally as well, he had made the right decision. Because right now, I mean, he felt great. He felt free for the first time in a long time. And so he did what he had to do. And so Henry finished his laps with the horse, and then he walked it over to the watering trough, which was underneath this big oak tree near the barn. And he had just tied the horse to that oak tree to let it drink when he heard someone shouting his name. Henry spun around, and he saw a man stalking toward him from across the field. And the man was Maisie's older brother, Filford. And his face was bright red, and he was glaring at Henry like he meant to kill him here, which Henry realized was a very real possibility, considering what Henry had just done to Filford's sister. And then on top of that, as Henry's sort of taking this all in, he sees that Filford doesn't just look mad. He's also carrying a rifle, this old-fashioned rifle. And when Henry saw the gun, he immediately panicked and he turned to run away, but the huge oak tree was in his way. He sort of bounced off the tree and he turned back around. And by this point, Filford had closed the distance, and there was clearly nowhere where Henry could reasonably run without still clearly being in range of Filford's weapon. And so Henry, not knowing what else to do, just dropped to his knees and threw his hands up and begged Filford for mercy, telling him, like, you don't understand, like, we had to break up. Like, I would never want to hurt Maisie on purpose. You got to believe me. Like, she wouldn't want you to do this. Like, you got to spare me. She loved me. Like, let it go. And for a moment, Henry felt like maybe he'd gotten through to Filford and he wasn't going to get shot here. You know, Filford, who by this point was only a few feet away from Henry, he was still gripping his gun, just glaring at Henry. And there was this moment of just really intense silence. And then he said something that made Henry's stomach drop. He told him that he would have no way of knowing what Maisie would have wanted to do here with Henry, because earlier that very morning, his sister had taken her own life. And then Filford, he raised his rifle and he fired. Pain immediately exploded in Henry's head, and he felt himself get literally thrown backwards really hard. And he bounced off the oak tree and fell to the ground, expecting at any point for everything to just go black forever, to just die and be done with it. But after a few seconds, he realized he wasn't dead. His head was pounding from where he had just been shot, and he could feel blood running into his eyes and all over his whole body. So clearly he knows he's been shot, but like somehow he's still conscious. And then he heard the sound of Filford reloading his rifle. Henry considered trying to get up and making a run for it, but it was like, what chance did he really stand here? He's already been shot once. The guy's clearly willing to shoot him. He's reloading. He's right in front of him. How far can he possibly get before he gets shot again? So instead, he just lay still and prayed that maybe Filford would think he was dead and not shoot him again. And so Henry's heart hammered in his chest as he listened to the sounds, the mechanical sounds of Filford reloading this rifle. And this was a painfully slow process because Filford's gun was an old army musket from the Civil War. So he's like, packing gunpowder and like a lead pellet into the barrel of this gun. This is a lengthy reloading process. And this whole time, Henry, as he's listening to this, he's just holding his breath, trying to be still. But at the same time, he's getting more and more certain that he was about to die. Like, there was no way he was not about to get shot again. What else could Filford be doing? Finally, Henry heard the metal click of the gun cocking, which meant that it was now loaded. And so Henry, trying his best still not to move, he still tensed up a little bit, bracing for the impact. And then there was this deafening bang, just like the first one. As soon as he heard it, Henry flinched, but he didn't feel anything. Instead, he just heard a thump and then silence. He waited a few more seconds, and then he opened one eye, and Filford was lying a few feet away, bleeding profusely from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot to his head. Despite being shot in the head, Henry would survive this attempt on his life, and Filford would die from the self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, Henry did understand that, by breaking up with Maisie, it had very likely led to her taking her life, and it almost got him killed, and it definitely led to Filford taking his life. Like, there's a lot of death and tragedy here because of something that, Henry largely did, but he didn't feel any guilt after he ultimately survived this attempt on his life. The way he rationalized it was he thought that Maisie and Filford were just both very weak. I mean, Maisie, instead of trying to move on and rebuild like a strong person, she had been weak and she had taken the easy way out. And Filford, he had one shot, point blank. He could have shot and killed Henry and gotten his justice, but he missed, and then he took the easy way out. He took his own life instead of facing consequences. And so Henry just felt like, screw those people. And after that day that he was attacked by Filford, it was like his luck just seemed to get better and better. His head wound really had been superficial, and it healed quickly. And soon after he was fully recovered, he married a wealthy widow. And with her money, his farm grew, and he eventually became one of the richest men in the whole area. And as the years went by, his thoughts about Maisie and Filford just kind of faded into the background, until everything that happened just sort of felt like a distant memory from an entirely different life. That is, until 20 years later, on March 21st, 1905. On this morning, Henry was cutting down some old dying trees on his property with his teenage son. Now, at this point, Henry had plenty of farmhands, so he didn't have to do this kind of job himself. But he liked showing his son how things were done, so this was like a teaching moment. Now, so far that day, they'd been working their way through some of the smaller trees that needed to get removed. But the last one, the big oak tree near the barn, had wood that was so hard that their saws could not cut through it. So Henry explained to his son what you do in this type of situation, which is you get some dynamite and you literally blow the tree up. And Henry had some dynamite just for this occasion, and he grabbed it and he walked over to this oak tree and he jammed it inside of the hollow of the trunk. He told his son to get back, and then he lit the fuse, and then he hustled back with his son, and they hid behind shelter, and they watched and they waited. And after a few seconds, the fuse burned all the way into the dynamite, and then it exploded. 20 years earlier, when Henry was shot in the head by Filford and narrowly survived, well, that bullet that hit him, it literally ricocheted off his skull and lodged in the oak tree right behind him. Like, it just basically bounced off his head. And that bullet remained lodged in that oak tree for the 20 years after. And then comes the day that Henry decides he wants to take this tree down, and he can't cut it down. So what does he do? He puts dynamite inside, and he decides he's going to blow it up. And after lighting the fuse, he and his son, they go all the way 50 feet away, thinking they're well out of harm's way here for when this thing detonates. Except they weren't. When that dynamite exploded, the force of the explosion basically rocketed that bullet that was still lodged in the tree right back at Henry. It hit him square in the head, and this time it penetrated and it killed him instantly. So, in essence, Filford didn't miss. It just took 20 years for the bullet he fired to kill Henry. On the evening of November 22nd, 2018, a middle-aged woman named Mandy was sitting in her living room at her home in a coastal town in southern England, reading a book while the TV played as background noise. And as she was sitting there, she heard the distinctive sound of footsteps kind of shuffling down the stairs. And Mandy looked up and she watched as her wife, Lena, came stumbling down the stairs, and in her hand was her favorite cup, which was a mason jar with a metal straw in it. And Mandy watched as Lena stumbled her way into the living room and then began, stumbling over towards the kitchen. And as she did this, Mandy just kind of cringed, because Mandy knew what Lena was about to do. And sure enough, just a moment later, when Lena had made her way into the kitchen, sort of out of sight, Mandy heard the sound of the refrigerator door opening up, and then the distinctive sound of liquid being poured into a cup, as Lena made herself another cocktail of vodka and orange juice. So Mandy had married Lena 4 years ago, and for that entire time, Lena had been a drinker. But Mandy always tried hard not to harp too much on Lena for drinking too much, because she knew that Lena really only drank alcohol to help manage her overwhelming back pain. So about 40 years earlier, when Lena was much younger, she had been a competitive horse jockey and racehorse trainer. But when she was 21 years old, she had suffered this awful horse riding accident that had permanently damaged her spine. She had developed scoliosis and had been in constant pain from this injury ever since. And sometimes the pain would get so bad that Lena would literally just collapse to the ground and couldn't do anything. But alcohol numbed the pain a little bit. And sometimes the pain would get so bad that Lena would literally just collapse to the ground and just lay there writhing in pain. I mean, this was like a very serious amount of discomfort. Now, at first, Lena's doctors had been prescribing her fentanyl, a very powerful pain medication, to help manage her pain. But Lena began showing signs of becoming addicted to fentanyl, and so before that could really happen, doctors had stepped in and weaned her off of the fentanyl. But Lena, at this point, she didn't want to become addicted to pills either, but she also still had this pain, and without the fentanyl, there was no pain numbing happening. And so Lena had begun self-medicating by drinking about half a liter of vodka every single day. And she would mix the vodka, often with orange juice, and she would carry it around the house in her mason jar with that metal straw. And so anytime Mandy saw her with that, she knew what she was doing. Now, Mandy knew that Lena's drinking was obviously an issue. I mean, they replaced addiction, for pills with alcohol addiction, but at the same time, Mandy just felt like, I can't really get in the way of this. She's in so much pain. What can really be done here? So after hearing the sound of Lena getting another drink, Mandy just went back to reading her book on the couch. But as she was reading, with the TV playing in the background and the sound of Lena sort of doing whatever she was doing in the kitchen, there was suddenly this really weird noise that actually pulled Mandy out of her book. It almost sounded like a gurgling sound that was coming from the kitchen. So Mandy got up to go see what was going on. When Mandy walked into the kitchen, she saw Lena was on the ground. She was laid out flat on the floor, still holding her mason jar. But Mandy didn't panic. I mean, Lena's falls were just a fact of life, and all Mandy needed to do now was just help Lena back up again. But when Mandy bent down to do that, she got a look at Lena's face. And in one terrible moment, she instantly understood what that gurgling noise was and what had happened to Lena. And so Mandy, she lunged for her phone and she called the police. It would turn out that night, Lena actually was not drunk. She was walking around with her favorite drinking cup, but she was actually going into the kitchen to get more water. She was just thirsty. The reason she was hobbling all around, sort of acting drunk, if you weren't looking closely, is just because of her back pain. That's what was causing her to stumble around. But in the kitchen, after filling up her mason jar with water, she stumbled and fell like she would when she was drunk. But again, this time it's just from pain. And she fell onto her mason jar. Specifically, her eye socket landed on that upturned metal straw, and it impaled her skull, punctured her brain, and caused a traumatic brain injury. The sound of her gurgling was because of that traumatic brain injury, which would ultimately kill her. Today's video is a collection of 5 fan-favorite stories that are all about people who unknowingly walked into truly deadly situations, only realizing it when it was already too late. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you may have heard or seen some or all of them, this will feel like a brand new viewing experience. Also, for all you longtime fans of the YouTube channel, make sure you pay close attention to see if you can find the secret image that's embedded in one of these stories. The first person who spots the image and comments what the image is and the timestamp of where in the video it is, if you put that in the comments section, we will pin your comment to the top of the comments section and you will reap all the glory. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house, and for no reason at all, just kick their front door in and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker he wrote himself a reminder: I will become a world-famous photographer and I will let nothing stand in my way. Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. Like this shot of a fishing boat coming back into port in a large swell won a competition that put it all over the London Underground. Or this shot he took, which is off the coast of Sumatra out in the middle of the ocean, as Jacob and his friend are right in front of the supertanker that's bearing down on both of them, and his friend is surfing off the wake caused by the supertanker. So a very dangerous picture to take, but it won an award that was run by The Guardian. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends, because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water, and then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool. And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous. There were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside and he would film it inside and just on top. And he would upload his videos to YouTube and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28th, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horse head mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side, and he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth a couple of times and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the pool side and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. And so David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side. From a young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense love of learning. When she learned how to read, her parents had to bribe her to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about all things, her favorite subject was French culture. And so she began devouring all things French, and then in middle school, she began studying the language, and by high school, she was nearly fluent and taking college-level French courses. Carrie would go on to earn several degrees in French, including a PhD. And in 2019, she put that PhD to use when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to campus. So in August of 2020, shortly after Carrie's 38th birthday, she, along with her two beloved cats, moved just 10 minutes away from Boston University into an old apartment building on a busy street. With her apartment still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture wrapped in plastic, Carrie broke out out her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the year titled "The Joy of Learning French." In it, her students saw her passion for the French language and how excited she was about the upcoming academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after classes, and she had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture that she wanted to haul up to her apartment. This piece of furniture was not actually assembled. All the parts and the directions were inside of this box that was 7 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. And so Carrie got this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building into the first floor lobby, where she leaned it up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. To understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of how Carrie's elevator worked. Once the elevator car arrived on your floor, you would slide open this big door called the hoistway door. And on the other side, you would see the elevator car, and on the car itself would be yet another door. This door is called the car gate. This metal accordion-style door would also be slid to the side manually, but unlike the hoistway door, the car gate had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to move between floors. So when the light dinged in the first floor lobby above Carrie's head, she opened up the hoistway door, and then she reached inside and slid open the car gate, and then she grabbed her package and began trying to push it inside of the elevator car. The only way it looked like she could fit this huge package inside of the elevator was if she got it in there at an angle standing up. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled on it, she just could not get it to go inside. And so while Carrie's doing this, another tenant happened to walk in the front doors of the apartment building, and they saw Carrie struggling, and at first he just walked past Carrie and started going up the stairs towards his own apartment, but he stopped and he turned and he just said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy to be on that elevator. The elevator's really old and you might trip a sensor and it might start moving before you're ready. You know, we've had problems with that elevator before. It's just not worth the risk." And so Carrie, who's already pretty committed to doing this, she hesitates for a second and just kind of looks at her package, and she looks up at the guy and says, "You know what, I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." And so Carrie goes back to trying to get it on, and this other tenant hesitates for a second and then decides, okay, I'll help her do it. And so he goes down and he holds open the hoistway door with his hand, and Carrie goes inside of the elevator car and she uses her hip to keep open the car gate. And the two of them begin pushing and pulling, and finally they're able to wedge this package at an angle inside of the elevator car. And so Carrie thanks the guy and he says no problem. He turns and walks up the stairs and he disappears. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, a maintenance worker in the floor below her, which was the basement, hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, the top of her huge package, when they wedged it inside, had pressed up against the sensor at the top of the door frame that registers when the car gate has shut. And so when the maintenance worker pressed the call button, because that package was pressing on the sensor, it tricked the elevator into thinking the gate was shut and secured, and now it was time to move. And so the car began to go down, but it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor, causing the elevator to stop. Carrie was most likely very confused how this car would have moved, considering the car gate was still wide open, but she had bigger problems. She was now trapped between the first floor lobby and the basement. But she didn't panic. Instead, she decided she would just get her package back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. The package, when it came off that sensor, had fallen forward and was basically jutting out of the elevator. So the top half of it was in the first floor lobby, propped up against the floor of the first floor lobby. And so Carrie turned around so her back was facing outside of the elevator, and she got down in a squatting position underneath her package, so her shoulder was up against the package, and then she began pressing it up as hard as she could until she managed to press the package back inside of the car. But again, the top of that package made contact with that sensor that registers whether that gate is shut, and so believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. And this time, Carrie, whose back is to the opening of the elevator, she lost her balance and fell backwards out of the elevator into that narrow space between the outside of the elevator and the inside of the elevator shaft. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator, but unfortunately, her package this time did not slip off the sensor. And so the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and so it kept on moving down. And so as soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the movement of the elevator would have kind of sucked her up into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the car forces its way down past her towards the basement. But the car doesn't even get to the basement. It stops once Carrie is pinned perfectly between the elevator and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was too late. Carrie was already deceased. On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there was some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escapes. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people, they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this. Do not climb on top of this factory. It's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof. They're all super excited and the game has begun. It's 2:30. And as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted. And there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game. They're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos. And Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall. They're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible, blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked and shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles, actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam. Thomas, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In 1996, 21-year-old Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5, 4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22 Ton lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the Two-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it. They looked at the map and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road. It would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass, and you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop-off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse, and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally, they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had 2 paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive, and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off, and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road, and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes. But you got to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses, or there'll be a gas station, or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what? It's 2 a.m, we're tired, let's sleep here, we'll leave the car running, it'll be nice and warm, and when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems, we'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running, it's nice and warm, and when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday, maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here, they'll come by and late on a winter night in the 1970s, a middle-aged train driver named Takashi Ito, along with his assistant, were sitting in the front seat of a small cargo train that was hurtling along the tracks in Hokkaido, Japan. So this was just a 2-car train. There was a cargo train in back, and then there was the front train that, Takashi and his assistant were in. There were no passengers behind them, so it's just these two. And the area that they were driving through was this very desolate area. And basically outside, if they looked out their windshield, all they would have seen was just basically snow and ice and just pitch black darkness and the train's headlights pointing straight ahead. That would have been all they could see, was whatever, was in the headlights. And as they were driving along, they had shut all the windows to the car that they were in, but it was so cold outside and the wind was whipping and they're driving right into the wind that some of the cold air was coming in one of the windows. And, it's freezing cold out there. It was starting to get really cold inside the cabin. And so, both men are starting to shiver. And so at some point, Takashi turns to his assistant and he just tells him to, hey, go ahead and open up the heating vent on the floor. So there was just this little vent that you could open up that would basically expose the engine to the main cabin, and so some heat would come up from the engine. But it would get really hot really quickly, and so you couldn't do it for very long, but it was getting pretty cold. So the situation called for it. And so Takashi sort of had one eye half focused out the windshield, sort of roughly following along with the direction they were going. And then the rest of his attention was just on his assistant, who was doing this mundane task of crouching down and sliding open this vent here. And at some point, the assistant managed to open up the heating box. And right as he did, something caught Takashi's eye outside of the train. Now remember, it's the middle of the night, it's the dead of winter, there's really nothing out there. And even though, of course, it's Takashi's job to pay attention to what's out in front of them, there's no expectation he's going to see anything on the tracks at all until he gets to the next stop, which was quite a ways away. And so the fact that anything caught his attention was alarming, and he turns and he looks out the windshield and he can't believe what he sees right in the middle of the tracks. Just several dozen yards ahead of the speeding train is a woman. She's just standing in the middle of the tracks looking up at the train and doesn't even appear to be trying to move, but she clearly sees the train barreling down on her. She looks terrified, and Takashi and the assistant, they look at each other, they start trying to get the train to stop, but there's no way. The train's going way too fast, it's way too heavy, and so it's like they throw the brakes on, they're trying to stop, but there's nothing they can do, and this woman, she's just not moving. And then eventually the train smashes into her, and like Takashi and the assistant are like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And the train, it eventually comes to a grinding stop, several hundred yards away. And then finally, when it's actually stopped, it's like Takashi and the assistant, they know what's happened. They've just killed someone. I mean, it's clearly an accident, but like the shock of this was unbelievable. And so finally, Takashi, he looks at the assistant and he's like, we have to go out and see if she's okay. I mean, they both knew there was no chance. Like, there's no chance she's alive after being hit by the train. But out they go, and sort of apprehensively, they began walking in the snow towards the back of the train. Now, neither of them had a lighting source. They didn't have a flashlight or anything like that. And they're going towards the back of the train. So they don't have the advantage of the headlights shining where they need to go. All they have are the taillights of the train, which are now flashing red. And so as they're walking through the snow and the wind is whipping and it's pitch black out there, and of course these two men, they're in shock about what they've just seen. They can't believe, like, what was she doing out here? Like, what happened? They're walking and all they're seeing out in front of them is darkness and the occasional, flash of red light that sort of roughly illuminated the snow out beyond the train, and then back to darkness. And they know somewhere out there behind the train is this woman who almost certainly is dead. So it means that there's like a dead body out there. And so Takashi and the assistant, they start making their way back towards the back of the cargo train, and then they begin walking beyond where the train was, basically along the tracks they had just covered. And sure enough, up ahead, periodically illuminated by these red lights, was this, mound on the tracks. It looked very much like a body. And sure enough, as Takashi got closer, he realized it was the woman. And almost immediately, he could tell, one, she was definitely dead. And in some ways, he kind of hoped maybe, there was some miracle that she had survived somehow, maybe, but definitely confirmed that she's dead. And the second thing was he could sort of see what happened here. Her foot appeared to be wedged in the tracks. She must have been stuck in the tracks. And even though it looked like she wasn't trying to move, it might have been because she literally couldn't. And so she was trapped, and we hit her and we killed her. But that wasn't all. I mean, this scene was horrible. I mean, her body was destroyed. But more than that, part of her body was missing. All they saw on the tracks were actually just her legs. It was just her lower half, and she had these lace-up dance shoes that would have been very difficult to take off. You know, the dance shoes sort of gave away that this was the woman. You know, they look like feminine legs, feminine feet. But again, her upper half is just gone. And so Takashi and the assistant, they sort of look around in the general vicinity to see if, you know, her upper half is nearby. And again, all they have is this periodic red flashing light across the snow, and it's dark, it's cold, the wind is whipping. And sure enough, just a little ways off the tracks, they see another sort of heap on the ground, and there's nothing else out here. So this has got to be the woman's upper body. And so they cross over the tracks, they leave behind the lower half, and they see there's like a trail of blood across the snow. And when they get to this second mound, it is this woman's upper body. But I mean, the scene, it would have been horrible for anyone to find this, but it was especially so because as they walked up to this woman's clearly, you know, dead upper half, she was looking right at them. I mean, her arms were outstretched and her eyes were open, and her torso, it's positioned in such a way that she was almost like staring at them. And they walk up to her, and her face, Takashi would say that it was almost like she was looking at him with an accusatory look, like she was mad at him for not having stopped the train. Couldn't you see I was trapped on the train? Like, that's what Takashi's thinking. Like, this dead woman is mad at me. She looks like she's furious with me. And so, you know, it was very hard, but they continued walking towards her to, you know, just really confirm that she's definitely dead. This is not like a second person here, but no, it was clearly just the upper half of this woman, and she was definitely dead. And despite the very unsettling nature of the way her body was positioned, ultimately, Takashi and the assistant, you know, just turned around and began walking back towards the train. Now, this is 1970s Japan. They don't have cell phones. In fact, they didn't even have radios. Like, they didn't have a good way to get in touch with anyone. They clearly knew they needed to tell authorities what happened here, but realistically, the only way to do that was to go to the train, and then one of them would have to basically walk to the nearest civilization and get help that way, while the other person stayed with the train and also with the woman. And so the two of them, they get back to the train, they get inside of that front car, inside of the enclosed warm space, and they shut the doors, and they sort of just look at each other like, okay, you know, this is obviously horrible, but like, what are we gonna do? And Takashi, being the more senior of the two, said, well, look, I'll stay here with the train. You, the assistant, go out and get help. You know, I'll be here when you come back.
When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today.
And so the assistant, as much as it was sort of daunting to have to walk off into the darkness and the freezing cold, it almost was like a relief to get away from this scene. I mean, this was truly horrific. And so, you know, Takashi watched as the assistant bundled up in his jacket, and he headed out the side of the car door, and then off into the darkness he went. And then Takashi was left alone inside of the train with, you know, this woman's body behind them on the tracks. And so shortly after the assistant had gone, Takashi, you know, he's just sitting inside of this unmoving train car. And remember, they had that heating vent open, and even though the train was not moving, there was still quite a bit of heat that was coming up into the cabin. And so it was actually getting quite toasty inside of this train car. And Takashi is literally just not moving. He's just sitting there waiting, you know, just trying not to let his mind wander to this horrible thing that's happened behind him. And he found himself actually feeling kind of tired. I mean, he had had a really long day. I mean, he'd been up for nearly 24 hours at this point. And so suddenly he was like, man, maybe I ought to just lay down and close my eyes for a minute, because obviously when they come back here, they'll wake me up, like, no problem. And so Takashi did eventually get down on the ground right next to that vent, so he was really getting the maximum amount of heat. And he curled up and he closed his eyes. But pretty much immediately, once Takashi closed his eyes and effectively attempted to sleep, all he could see in his mind was that woman standing on the tracks looking up at him before she was struck by the train. And then he would try to, force himself not to think about that, telling himself it really was an accident. He could not have stopped the train. And also, they rounded a corner before they saw her. It wasn't like they could have seen her if they hadn't been fiddling around with the heating vent beforehand. They wouldn't have seen her. They had to turn that corner, and then they saw her. Like, there was no way to avoid this. This was an accident. But it's like he couldn't get that image of the woman out of his mind. And then if he managed not to think about her on the tracks, his mind would then jump to seeing her upper half positioned on the snow with her eyes still open, looking at him with this, in his mind, this sort of accusatory look on her face. And so he can't sleep, but like he's so exhausted from the day and he's just so worn out, it's so traumatic that eventually after, 10 minutes or so, he did begin to feel himself sort of allowing himself to drift off to sleep. Like he did have these horrible thoughts, but he felt himself getting closer to finally being able to get a little bit of sleep. And right at that point, right as he's teetering on actually sleeping, he hears something outside. Now, remember, it's late at night, the wind is whipping, it's the middle of winter, and so there had been this ongoing ambiance of the howling wind and like nighttime winter sounds outside. There are animals out there. I mean, there's lots of noises going on here. But whatever the sound was, he just couldn't quite place it. It almost sounded like metallic, like something was scraping against something else, like maybe two pieces of metal were grinding together, like but he couldn't quite tell what it was, how far away it was, but it really stood out right away amongst all the other noises he was hearing. And so he's laying there on the ground and he's listening to the sound. He can't quite place how close or far away it is. For all he knows, it could be way off in the distance or it could be right in the cargo train behind him. And so as he hears this sound, which is sort of periodic, he tells himself like, oh, maybe it's my assistant. Maybe he's back with help. Maybe he found someone really quickly, because it's only been like 10 minutes since he left. But then he's thinking like, there's no way. Like, I know we're sort of in the middle of nowhere. We're in this really desolate part of Japan. Like, there's no way he would have just magically found help that quickly. So it can't be my assistant. Unless maybe he's turned around for some reason, but, why would he do that? And so he's sort of picturing like, what were the reasons that it could be the assistant? And as he's doing that, the sound is getting louder, and it's definitely getting closer. And the sound is, again, it's like a it's like a grinding sort of like movement almost, like something's coming towards him. And he can tell now that the sound, whatever it is definitely near like the cargo train. Like it's right behind where he is. And the way he's laying, his head is towards the front of the train, so his feet are close to the door that led out into the open and then would eventually lead you to the cargo train behind. And so he's starting to get sort of apprehensive. Like, what is that? Is it like an animal? Like, could it be the wind? Is it like somehow whipping against the train in some way that it's making this strange sound? And all the while, this grinding sort of like rhythmic sound is getting louder and louder and sort of faster and faster. And then finally, as the sound is so loud that it's practically echoing inside of this room he's in, he hears the door to where he is slide open. And he turns and he looks to see what is coming into the train. And when he sees what it is, he starts to scream. About an hour later, Takashi's assistant, who had managed to go get help, was in the back seat of a police cruiser along with two police officers who were driving in the direction of this train. There was actually a road that kind of cut out into this sort of desolate area that overlooked the train tracks, and sure enough, they pulled into this sort of carve out on the road, and the assistant pointed, and there it was. There was the train sort of off in the distance, sort of walking distance from where the car was. And so the cops, they parked, and all three of them, they get out, and the police officers, they had flashlights. And so it was much easier to navigate the sort of barren terrain here. And they walked away from the car down to the train. Now, remember, obviously there has been a tragedy here. This woman was struck by the train. And of course, the police know this by this point, and the assistant knows that's what they're walking up to, the scene of this woman being killed. But there really wasn't anything, sort of darker than that. Like, this was a terrible accident. but it's sort of like we just got to follow protocol now. We got to go down there, we got to figure out what happened and sort of, follow process, if you will. And so the three of them, they know what they're walking into, right? They're going to meet Takashi. He's waiting in the train, and they're going to take it from there. And so they're walking through the darkness, and they're shining their lights, and the assistant is behind the two police officers, and they're walking up to the train. And when they get close enough to the train, the assistant begins yelling out for Takashi to let him know, like, hey, we're here, we're here, like, come on out. But Takashi doesn't call back. He doesn't come out of the train. But again, this is not like hugely alarming. The assistant's like, okay, maybe he fell asleep inside of the train car. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they make their way over to the door that leads into the front car of the train, and they slide it open and they step inside. It's a very small space, and Takashi's not in there. And there's no sign of anything bad that's happened. He's just not in here. And so the assistant's like, okay, that's weird. It's sort of odd that he didn't respond to us calling for him. He's not in here, but maybe he's in the cargo train, the second car for some reason. And so they leave the front train car and they go into the cargo train car, and Takashi's not in there either. And so at this point, the cops are looking at the assistant like, what's going on here? Like, where would Takashi be? It's the middle of the night. Like, it's just pure barren wasteland. It's ice and snow everywhere. Why would he leave? And so the assistant's like, maybe he left and he's with the body. Maybe he was just standing with the body or something. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they begin walking towards the back of the train and then begin following the tracks towards where, the lower half of this woman is, according to the assistant. And so down the tracks they go, and sure enough, eventually they see up ahead the legs that are sort of still stuck in the tracks. And as they're shining the light and they're calling out for Takashi, there's no answer, and Takashi is nowhere to be found. And so now the assistant's really getting worried. Like, it didn't make any sense. Where could he have gone? The only other place that made any sense was maybe over near the torso. But the assistant knows, like, of all places that at least he would want to be, it would not be near the upper half. I mean, that was so creepy. The way the body was positioned, the way it was staring at them. And he knew Takashi had been really unsettled by it. So why would he go over to that? But he told the cops, like, hey, shine the light sort of over there off the tracks, because the upper half of this woman, that's where she is. Maybe he's over there. And so they shine their lights in the direction of where the upper half was. And there's no Takashi, and there's no upper half. There is no torso. The woman's torso is gone. And where it was, very clearly, is this huge sort of like flattened section of snow with blood everywhere. And it's like this just horrible scene, but there's no upper body. So Takashi's gone, and this woman's body, her upper half anyways, is gone. And so now, like, the assistant and the officers, they really don't know what to make of this. But the first thought, at least from the assistant, was maybe a bear came through and was, basically taking the woman's body to go eat it or something. And maybe Takashi was out here, and maybe he got chased off by the bear, or worse, maybe he got attacked by the bear. And this sort of made sense. Like, oh my God, like, is there a bear nearby? Like, do we need to go in the train just to seek safety here? And so the police officers, they're sort of scanning their lights around, trying to see if maybe Takashi's nearby. And at some point they notice there's actually boot prints that leave where the torso had been. And they sort of took off into the night, sort of away from the train, sort of off into the distance. Now, there didn't appear to be any bear tracks around, but again, they're thinking that's what it could be, but they see these boot prints and they're like, we gotta go check. We gotta see if maybe these prints will lead us to Takashi. And so Takashi and the two officers, they begin following these tracks, and as they do, they see the prints, these boot prints, get farther and farther apart, like Takashi was running, like his stride was getting longer and longer, and there's blood everywhere, like this drag mark of blood all over the snow. And they follow these prints all the way past the train, way off into the night, where they finally stop in front of this huge utility pole. And at this point, they're looking around like, where's Takashi? Like, where did he go? Like, there's nothing down here. And then at some point, they hear something above them. And so the police officers, with their flashlights, they shine up towards the top of this utility pole, where at the top, there was this fairly large metal platform. And as they shine their lights up, they see Takashi. and he's draped over the edge of this platform, totally lifeless. His arms are dangling down, and he's got this horrible, huge wound across his stomach. He's bled all over. He's clearly deceased. And so they're shining their lights up at him, and like the shock of seeing Takashi is horrible. They back up. They're like, oh my God, is there a bear here? Did the bear somehow get up there with Takashi? Like what's making that noise up there? And they're shining their lights, and at some point they hear a noise again. And then as their lights are aimed towards Takashi in this platform, this figure sort of emerges above Takashi, like it crawled over Takashi, and it peered down at the two cops and the assistant. And it was the woman's torso. It's like her upper half. She sort of looked down at them, blood's all over her, and she's sort of clutching on to Takashi. And then in one move, she sort of thrust herself over his body and began pulling herself down the pole towards the men. And the men, they immediately start yelling, and they turn and they start running. And as they're running off, all they can hear behind them is chick, 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 which is the sound of this woman dragging herself through the snow towards them. Now, unfortunately, the assistant did not make it. The woman caught up to him. But the two police officers, they were able to run back to their car. They got in and they sped off towards the station, and they told people what was going on at this train. I mean, they couldn't even describe it really without it sounding totally made up. And so eventually, reinforcements head back to the train. And when they get there, they find the assistant. He clearly had been caught by this woman on his way to the car, and he was destroyed. His stomach was ripped wide open. He was dead. But, the authorities, they searched everywhere, and they couldn't find this woman. Her upper half was just gone. Her legs were still stuck in the tracks, but the murderous upper half of her was gone, and they never found her. Today, it's said that the animated top half of this woman's corpse still haunts the railroad tracks in Hokkaido. She's known as Tiki Tiki because that is the name that was given to sort of encapsulate the sound that she would make as she pulled herself through the snow. The sort of chik, chik sound became Tiki Tiki. Now, according to some versions of this story, after you've heard the legend of Tiki Tiki, like you have now, you only have 3 days before she shows up to get you. But it is possible to survive it. Before she slices you in half across your midsection, she'll pause to ask you one question. And if you answer this question correctly, she'll let you live. The question is, do you need your legs? And the only correct answer, spoken exactly like this, is yes, I need them right now. All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
On the morning of April 21st, 1972, a 55-year-old man named Albert was standing at his kitchen counter in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, and he was very carefully counting thick stacks of paper currency. Albert was a highly successful bookmaker, which meant he took bets on horse races and sporting events from some of the wealthiest people in the city. And he had been doing this exact job for over 30 years, so he had a very strict routine that he never deviated from. Now, Albert was a man who took an immense amount of pride in his professional reputation. He always wore a bespoke wool suit, he kept his silver hair perfectly combed, and he made sure his leather shoes were polished to a mirror shine. But his absolute biggest source of pride was the fact that he always paid out his winning clients in cash immediately without ever asking for a delay. And in order to maintain that reputation, Albert had to physically transport an enormous amount of physical cash across the city every single week. So, on this particular Friday morning, Albert finished counting his money and began packing it away. But he did not just put it into a standard briefcase. He used 2 extremely heavy, custom-made canvas bags, and these bags were completely unique to Albert. He had specifically asked his bank to paint a thick, bright red stripe down the side of both bags so that he would never accidentally mix his money up with anyone else's. And after he zipped the heavy bags shut, he lifted them off the counter and felt the familiar strain in his shoulders. He looked across the kitchen at his wife and said,
I will see you right after the settling is done." And then he walked out the front door, loaded the heavy canvas bags into the trunk of his sedan, and began the drive into the heart of Melbourne. Now, Friday was a very specific day in the Australian betting world. They called it Settling Day. And it was the one day of the week when all the elite bookmakers from across the city would gather in one single location to balance their ledgers, pay off their debts to one another, and secure their weekly profits. And the location for this gathering was the Victoria Club. The club was located on the second floor of a very prominent building right on Queen Street. And because it functioned essentially as a massive, unregulated bank vault every Friday, the security was incredibly tight. So when Albert arrived at the building, he parked his car and carried his 2 heavy canvas bags up the front steps. And he had to pass through a set of thick metal security doors and be visually identified by a doorman before he was allowed inside. But Albert was a fixture at the club, so the doorman just nodded and buzzed him through. And when Albert stepped into the main club room, the air was already thick with cigar smoke and the loud overlapping voices of dozens of men. There were roughly 40 other bookmakers inside, sitting at various tables, frantically writing in their leather-bound ledgers and handing over massive stacks of cash to one another. So Albert walked over to his usual table in the corner of the room. He set his 2 heavy canvas bags with the bright red stripes right on the floor between his feet. And then he sat down, opened his ledger, and began his work. And for the first couple of hours, everything proceeded exactly as it always did. Millions of dollars were changing hands across the tables, and the room was filled with the sounds of counting machines and casual banter. But right around noon, the heavy wooden doors of the main club room suddenly swung open, and the entire room went completely silent. Because the men walking through the door were not bookmakers and they had not been buzzed in by the security guard, there were 6 men in total, and they were all wearing identical blue boiler suits. Their faces were completely covered by thick woolen balaclavas, and every single one of them was holding a loaded submachine gun. The lead gunman walked directly into the center of the room and pointed the barrel of his weapon at the ceiling. He looked around at the stunned bookmakers and yelled, "Get on the floor and put your hands on your head." And nobody hesitated for even a fraction of a second. Albert immediately dropped from his chair onto his knees and then lay completely flat on the carpet. He pressed his cheek so hard against the floor that he could feel the rough fibers scratching his skin. His heart pounded rapidly against his ribs as he clasped his trembling hands behind his neck. But as Albert lay there, he realized that the men in the blue boiler suits were not acting like typical frantic criminals. They were incredibly calm, and they moved with absolute precision. They did not shout any further instructions, and they did not fire a single warning shot. Instead, they executed a highly rehearsed pattern. 2 of the gunmen immediately turned and stood with their backs to the door to guard the exit, and the other 4 men moved systematically from table to table, grabbing every single bag of cash they could find. And they specifically targeted the largest and heaviest bags, completely ignoring the smaller wallets or personal jewelry of the men on the floor. Albert lay there with his eyes squeezed shut, listening to the heavy thud of boots moving closer to his table. And then he heard a man stop, right next to his head. A second later, Albert felt the thick handles of his 2 canvas bags with the red stripes being yanked away from his feet. He did not look up or make a sound. He just listened to the heavy bags being dragged across the carpet and tossed into a larger canvas sack in the center of the room. And within less than 10 minutes, the entire operation was over. The men had gathered every single bag of cash in the club. They backed slowly out of the room, pulled the heavy doors shut behind them, and vanished down the stairwell. So for several long minutes, nobody in the Victoria Club dared to move. Albert and the other bookmakers just lay there on the floor, listening to the absolute silence of the building. And finally, one of the club managers cautiously stood up and immediately grabbed a telephone to call the authorities. Within 10 minutes, Queen Street was completely swarmed with police cruisers. The lead investigator assigned to the case was a veteran detective named John Murphy. And when Murphy walked into the Victoria Club and saw the sheer scale of the crime scene, he was completely astounded. The bookmakers were all frantically trying to calculate exactly how much money had just been taken. But because the nature of the betting business relied on unregistered, untraceable paper cash, getting an exact figure was nearly impossible. But after interviewing the men, Detective Murphy estimated that the thieves had walked out of the building with up to $15 million in today's currency. And they had done it flawlessly, in broad daylight. So Murphy immediately locked down the entire building and brought in a massive forensics team to sweep for evidence. They dusted every door handle, every table, and every surface the thieves might have touched. But the crime scene technicians found absolutely nothing. The thieves had worn thick gloves, so there were no fingerprints left behind. They had worn balaclavas, so no one could provide a facial description. And when Murphy interviewed the security guard downstairs, he learned that the thieves had somehow bypassed the complex locking mechanisms on the front doors without forcing them open. This meant the crew either had a perfectly duplicated set of keys or they had inside help. And later that same afternoon, the police received a call about a vehicle fire in a quiet residential suburb a few miles away. When Murphy and his team arrived at the scene, they found a large commercial van completely engulfed in flames. Witnesses said they saw several men in blue boiler suits jump out of the van, get into a second waiting vehicle, and speed away. The fire department extinguished the flames, but the intense heat had completely destroyed the van and any potential physical evidence inside. The police sifted through the ashes and found the charred remains of 6 submachine guns and several melted balaclavas, but there was nothing that could lead them to a specific suspect. But Detective Murphy was not entirely without leads. He was a veteran of the Melbourne police force, and he knew the local underworld very well. And he knew that there was only one crew in the entire city capable of executing a heist with this level of absolute discipline. It was a crew of highly organized armed robbers led by a notorious mastermind named Raymond Bennett. Ray was incredibly famous in the criminal underworld for his meticulous planning and his absolute refusal to leave physical evidence behind. So Murphy was completely convinced that Ray and his crew were the men in the blue boiler suits. And without wasting any time, the police immediately placed Ray and his known associates under intense, round-the-clock surveillance. They tapped the phones in their houses, they parked unmarked police vehicles at the end of their streets, and they followed them absolutely everywhere they went. And over the next few months, Murphy watched as these suspects suddenly began spending massive amounts of money. The men who were supposedly unemployed were suddenly buying brand new luxury vehicles straight off the dealership lots. They were paying off their residential mortgages in thick stacks of paper cash. And they were taking their families on lavish, expensive vacations across the country. It was completely obvious to Detective Murphy that this crew had just come into a massive amount of untraceable wealth. But in the legal system, knowing someone is guilty and proving it to a jury are two entirely different things. And Murphy was facing a massive, insurmountable problem, because all of the cash stolen from the Victoria Club was completely unregistered. Finding large sums of money in the possession of the suspects meant absolutely nothing in court. The police could not legally prove that the specific dollar bills Ray was spending were the exact same bills stolen from Albert and the other bookmakers. So the detectives repeatedly hauled Ray and his men into the interrogation rooms, and they pounded on the tables and demanded confessions. But Ray and his crew just sat there and smiled. They refused to answer any questions, and they knew the police had no physical evidence tying them to the club. And one evening, Detective Murphy stood in the precinct and slammed his fist onto his desk. He looked at his partner and said, "We have nothing to hold them on." And so as the months dragged on, the police investigation eventually hit a massive brick wall. The department simply could not justify the cost of maintaining round-the-clock surveillance on suspects they could not charge. So the unmarked cars were quietly pulled away and the wiretaps were eventually disconnected. The criminal crew had essentially pulled off the perfect heist. They had stolen $15 million, completely humiliated the police department, and walked away entirely scotangent-free. But while the law could not touch Ray Bennett and his men, the crew was about to completely destroy itself from the inside out. Because the fatal flaw in their perfect plan was not a mistake at the crime scene, it was simple, unadulterated greed. A few months after the police surveillance ended, one of the prominent crew members, a man named Tommy, went over to Ray Bennett's large new house for a drink. Right after the heist, Ray had personally divided the stolen money among the crew, and he had sworn to all of them on his life that he had counted every single penny and split the $15 million evenly. But as Tommy was walking down the hallway toward the bathroom in Ray's house, he accidentally turned the handle on the wrong door, and he found himself looking into Ray's private locked study. And sitting right there in the corner of the room, partially concealed beneath a heavy woolen blanket, were two distinct heavy canvas bags. And Tommy recognized them immediately because they had a thick, bright red stripe painted down the side. Now, Tommy knew exactly what those bags were. He had been the one who ripped them away from the feet of the bookmaker named Albert during the robbery, and he remembered exactly how incredibly heavy they had been. But when the crew had gathered to divide the money, Ray had specifically told everyone that those 2 bags with the red stripes only contained worthless betting slips and low-denomination coins. Ray had claimed he just threw them into the river to avoid the extra weight, but Tommy was standing in the study looking right at them, and he could clearly see that the canvas was bulging with thick stacks of paper cash. So Tommy slowly closed the door to the study and walked back into the living room. He stood over the coffee table, looked his boss directly in the eyes, and asked him, "Where are the bags with the red stripes?" And Ray did not flinch or look surprised. He just calmly took a sip of his whiskey, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, and said, "You got your share. Do not ask questions." But Tommy did not need any further explanation. He knew right in that exact moment that the mastermind had secretly shortchanged his own crew. Ray had hidden millions of dollars for himself and lied to the men who had risked decades in prison to pull off the job. So Tommy immediately left the house and drove across the city to tell the other members of the crew exactly what he had seen. And the realization that they had been robbed by their own boss completely shattered the crew. The intense loyalty and absolute trust that had allowed them to pull off the perfect crime evaporated overnight. And instead of going back to the police, the crew decided to handle the betrayal themselves. Just 3 weeks after Tommy confronted Ray in the living room, the underworld war officially began. Tommy was walking out of a crowded pub in downtown Melbourne late at night. He stepped onto the sidewalk and lit a cigarette. But as he exhaled the smoke, a dark sedan slowly pulled up to the curb right next to him. The passenger window rolled down, and the long barrel of a shotgun emerged from the darkness. Tommy did not even have time to yell before he was shot directly in the chest. He collapsed onto the concrete and died instantly while the sedan sped away into the night. But Tommy's assassination was only the beginning of the bloodshed. The betrayal over the stolen money sparked a vicious, paranoid war among the remaining crew members. Every single man involved in the heist suddenly believed that the others were coming to kill them for their share of the money. And over the next 2 years, the streets of Melbourne turned into an absolute war zone. A few months after Tommy was killed, a second member of the robbery crew was found dead inside the trunk of a stolen vehicle, having been beaten and shot multiple times. A third crew member simply walked out of his front door one sunny Tuesday morning to check his mailbox and was abruptly pulled into a passing van. He completely vanished and his body was never recovered. Now, the police were finding the bodies and investigating the murders, but the criminal code of silence in the underworld was so incredibly strong that absolutely no one would testify. The detectives knew exactly why these men were dying, but they could not prove who was pulling the triggers. It was a complete and total bloodbath. Almost every single man who was suspected of participating in the flawless Victoria Club heist was violently assassinated by rival mobsters and former friends, and eventually the violence caught up to the mastermind himself. 3 years after the Great Bookie robbery, Ray Bennett was actually sitting in police custody, facing trial for a completely unrelated minor criminal charge. He was being heavily escorted by several armed police officers up the front steps of a Melbourne courthouse for his preliminary hearing. But as he walked toward the heavy glass doors, a man disguised in a tailored business suit stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. The man completely ignored the armed police escorts, pulled a high-caliber handgun from his jacket, and fired multiple times at point-blank range. Ray was struck repeatedly in the chest and collapsed on the courthouse steps, dying before the paramedics could even arrive. And in the ensuing chaos, the well-dressed assassin simply dropped the weapon, slipped into the panicked crowd, and completely disappeared. And with the very public assassination of Ray Bennett, the final major player in the Great Bookie robbery was permanently silenced. The perfect heist had ultimately cost almost every single participant their life. The crew of masked men had managed to completely outsmart the police, bypass the complex security, and execute the largest robbery in Australian history. But they had completely destroyed themselves because they could not stop stealing from each other. As for the $15 million in stolen cash, it was never recovered. The authorities suspect that the money was quietly absorbed by various other criminal syndicates after the original crew members were wiped out. And to this day, not a single person has ever been officially charged, tried, or convicted for the flawless heist at the Victoria Club. But while the streets of Melbourne were consumed by the violent consequences of a perfect robbery gone wrong, a completely different kind of mystery was about to unfold in South America. Because just 1 year later, a man walking through a quiet rural field would come face to face with a silent, glowing object, leading to a medical anomaly that completely defies all logical explanation. On a humid afternoon in early July of 1973, 54-year-old Arcicio Bermudez was standing in the middle of a dense sugarcane field, and he was using a heavy machete to carefully clear away some overgrown brush that was encroaching on his crops. Arcicio lived in Anolaima, which was a highly remote agricultural municipality located deep in the mountainous region of Colombia, a couple of hours west of the capital city of Bogotá. And for Arcicio, this rugged, isolated landscape was essentially his entire world. He was a lifelong farmer who had spent decades working this exact piece of land, cultivating fruit and sugarcane for a living. So, he was a man defined entirely by his physical labor and his deep connection to his property. He was heavily built with hands that were permanently calloused from years of gripping tools and pulling thick weeds. And Arcicio did not live on this farm alone. He shared his modest wooden farmhouse with a very large extended family. His sister lived there along with her daughters and several of his young nephews. And because Arcicio was the eldest male in the house, he operated as the undisputed patriarch of the family. He took this responsibility incredibly seriously, always making sure the family had enough food on the table and that the property was completely secure from the elements. But this deep sense of responsibility also meant that Arcicio could be highly stubborn and overly protective. He absolutely refused to let anyone else handle the difficult tasks around the farm. If a heavy wooden fence post snapped in the middle of a torrential rainstorm, Arcicio would go out into the mud and fix it himself rather than wait for the weather to clear. And his sister would often scold him for working too hard, reminding him that he was 54 and needed to slow down. But Arcicio would just shake his head and tell her that the farm was not going to take care of itself. Now, on the evening of Wednesday, July 4th, the heavy afternoon rains had finally stopped, leaving the air around the farm feeling incredibly thick and humid. The sun had completely set, and the property was plunged into absolute darkness. Because the farm was so remote, there were absolutely no streetlights or neighbors nearby to break up the blackness of the valley. The only source of light came from the small, glowing lamps inside of Arcicio's living room. And inside the house, the family had just finished eating a large, late dinner together. Arcicio was sitting in his favorite wooden rocking chair near the front window, resting his tired legs and drinking a hot cup of black coffee. His sister was at the kitchen counter washing the dinner plates. And his nieces and nephews were sitting on the wooden floorboards, playing a quiet game of cards. It was a completely ordinary routine Wednesday night on the farm. But right around 8:15 in the evening, the small battery-powered radio sitting on the table next to Arcicio began to act up. It was tuned to a local news station out of Bogotá, but the broadcast was suddenly overwhelmed by a massive wave of heavy rhythmic static. Arcicio leaned forward and twisted the small tuning dial, trying to lock the signal back in. But the static just grew louder and more aggressive. And then the family's two large farm dogs, who had been sleeping out on the front porch, suddenly began barking frantically. Arcicio stopped messing with the radio and listened. The dogs were barking aggressively toward the lower pasture, but then, very abruptly, their barks turned into high-pitched whimpers. And Arcicio could clearly hear the sound of their claws scrambling across the wooden floorboards as they crawled underneath the porch to hide. So Arcicio put his coffee cup down and stood up from his rocking chair. He walked directly over to the front window and peered out through the glass into the darkness. And as he scanned the lower pasture, which was located about 100 yards away from the front porch, he saw something that made absolutely no sense. Down near the edge of the tree line, there was a massive, glowing object hovering just a few feet above the tall grass. It was completely silent, and it was emitting an intensely bright yellowish-orange light that was washing over the nearby trees and casting long, strange shadows across the pasture. And this object was moving incredibly slowly, gliding smoothly right above the uneven ground until it finally came to a complete stop near a small grassy hill. Now, the rest of the family had stopped what they were doing and crowded around the window to look. His nephew pointed at the light and asked, "What is that light down there?" Arcicio just stared at it for a long moment, trying to process the visual information. He knew that small, private planes and military helicopters sometimes flew over the region, but they never flew this low to the ground in the pitch black, and they definitely did not glow like a miniature sun. But Arcesio was a highly practical man who did not jump to wild conclusions. He immediately assumed that it had to be a conventional aircraft that had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and was forced to make a dangerous emergency landing right in his field. And if there were people trapped inside that broken wreckage, they would desperately need help. So Arcesio turned away from the window and grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from a shelf near the front door. He told his family to stay inside the house and lock the door behind him. His sister grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back. She looked at him and said, "We should just wait for the local police." But Arcesio pulled his arm away and shook his head. He looked back at her and said, "I have to go see if they need help." And without waiting for another word, he pushed the front door open, stepped out onto the porch, and began walking down the dark dirt path toward the lower pasture. And as Arcesio walked further away from the house, the thick humidity of the night air felt heavy in his lungs. The sounds of the local wildlife, the crickets and the frogs that were usually deafening after a rainstorm, were completely silent. As he got closer to the bottom of the hill, he began to hear a very faint, low-pitched humming sound. It was a steady, mechanical vibration that seemed to be coming from the glowing object. And the closer he got, the louder the humming became, until he could actually feel the vibration deep inside of his own chest. So, Arcesio raised his heavy metal flashlight and clicked the button, sending a beam of light cutting through the darkness. He aimed the beam directly at the hovering object, but the light from his flashlight was completely absorbed by the intense yellowish-orange illumination coming from the craft. And as Arcesio crossed the pasture and closed the distance to within about 20 feet, he finally came to a complete stop, because he could now clearly see that this was not a crashed airplane or a broken helicopter. It was a perfectly intact, completely smooth metallic object. There were no wings, no propellers, no tail rotor, and absolutely no windows. It was just a silent, hovering structure that was defying everything Arcesio knew about the world. He stood there completely frozen in the tall grass, gripping his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, intending to call out and see if anyone was in there. But before he could even push a single word out of his throat, the craft reacted to his presence. The yellowish-orange glow suddenly and violently shifted into a blinding, intense blue light. And a split second later, a single, highly concentrated flash of this blue light shot out from the craft and struck Arcesio directly in the face and chest. Arcesio instinctively dropped his flashlight and threw both of his hands up over his face. The blue flash was so incredibly bright that it temporarily blinded him, burning a bright white spot right into his retinas. And at that exact same moment, the deep humming sound abruptly, completely ceased. When Arcesio finally lowered his hands and blinked his eyes rapidly to try and clear his vision, he looked back toward the small hill, and the craft was entirely gone. The pasture was completely pitch black again, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the wet grass. Arcesio stood there in the dark for a long time, trying to catch his breath. His heart was pounding frantically against his ribs, and he felt a strange metallic taste in the back of his mouth. He bent down, fumbled in the grass until he found his flashlight, and then he turned around and walked very quickly back up the dirt path toward his farmhouse. When he opened the front door and stepped inside, his family immediately rushed over to him. His face was completely drained of color, and he was sweating heavily. His sister looked at him and asked what happened down there, and Arcesio just walked past her and sat heavily back into his wooden rocking chair. He stared blankly at the floorboards and said it just flashed a light and flew away. And for the rest of the night, Arcesio completely refused to talk about the incident. He was a man who relied on logic and hard work, and he simply did not have the vocabulary to explain what he had just experienced. He told his family that it must have been some kind of secret military drone, and that they were just going to forget they ever saw it. So the family eventually went to bed. And the next morning, Arcesio woke up at his usual time, drank his black coffee, and went right back out into the fields to work. He seemed entirely normal, and for a brief period, the family completely moved on from the strange event in the pasture. But 48 hours later, on the morning of July 6th, Arcesio did not come out of his bedroom. When his sister noticed that his coffee cup was still clean in the sink, she walked down the hall and pushed his bedroom door open. And she found her fiercely independent, hard-working brother lying flat on his back, buried underneath 3 heavy woolen blankets. He was shivering violently. His teeth were chattering audibly, and his entire face was covered in a thick layer of cold, clammy sweat. Arcesio looked up at his sister with heavy, tired eyes and said, "I feel incredibly sick." So his sister immediately made a very logical assumption. She figured that Arcesio had simply caught a severe case of the flu or a bad tropical fever. He worked out in the rain and the mud constantly, and it was entirely normal for farmers in the region to occasionally fall ill from the elements. She went into the kitchen, brewed him a large pot of hot herbal tea, and brought him some basic over-the-counter fever medication. And for the rest of the day, the family treated him exactly as they would for a bad cold, making sure he stayed hydrated and rested. But by the following morning, Arcesio's condition had drastically escalated. The violent shivering had completely stopped, but it had been replaced by something much worse. His core body temperature was rapidly plummeting, and his skin felt completely ice-cold to the touch. And when his sister pulled the heavy blankets back to adjust his pillows, she noticed something highly alarming on his skin. Scattered all across his arms, his chest, and his neck were dozens of small, irregular blue spots. They looked exactly like deep, dark bruises. But Arcesio had been in bed for 2 days and had not bumped into anything. And as she was staring at these strange blue spots, Arcesio suddenly leaned over the edge of the mattress and began vomiting into a bucket on the floor. But it was not normal stomach fluid. The bucket was rapidly filling with dark coagulated blood. His sister screamed for her nephews to come into the room. They rushed through the door and found Arcesio clutching his stomach, groaning in absolute agony as the gastrointestinal hemorrhaging continued. And the family immediately knew that this was not a simple case of the flu. They quickly wrapped Arcesio in a heavy blanket, carried him out to their old pickup truck, and sped down the winding mountain roads toward the local medical clinic in the center of Analima. When they arrived at the clinic, the local doctor took one look at Arcesio's plummeting temperature, the rapid blood loss, and the strange blue spots covering his torso, and he immediately threw his hands up. The doctor realized that this was a catastrophic, systemic failure that he was completely unequipped to handle. So he immediately ordered an emergency medical transport. And Arcesio was loaded into the back of an ambulance and rushed directly to a massive modern hospital in the capital city of Bogota. Once Arcesio was wheeled through the emergency doors of the hospital in Bogota, a large team of highly trained physicians immediately took over. They hooked him up to multiple intravenous lines, ordered a massive blood transfusion to replace what he was losing from the internal hemorrhaging, and ran a comprehensive battery of blood tests. The lead physician pulled Arcesio's sister out into the hallway and began aggressively questioning her. He asked her to list every single chemical, pesticide, fertilizer, or industrial solvent that Arcesio might have accidentally ingested on the farm. But she shook her head and insisted that they did not use harsh chemicals. She told the doctor that Arcesio was perfectly healthy until he walked out into their pasture a few nights ago to look at a strange light. And over the course of the next several days, the medical team in Bogota watched in absolute disbelief as Arcesio's body completely unraveled at a cellular level. The blue spots on his skin multiplied rapidly, spreading down his legs and across his back. His liver and his kidneys began to systematically shut down, causing toxins to build up in his bloodstream. And when the laboratory technicians sent back the results of his blood work, the doctors were stunned to see that Arcesio's white blood cell count had essentially dropped to absolute zero. His bone marrow had stopped producing the cells entirely, leaving him with absolutely no immune system to fight off any infections. So the doctors called an emergency conference, bringing in specialists from various departments to review the charts. And as they laid out the symptoms, the sudden onset of severe chills, the highly specific blue spots indicating subdural bleeding, the massive gastrointestinal hemorrhaging, and the total rapid destruction of his white blood cells, the medical team came to a unanimous definitive diagnosis. But it was a diagnosis that made absolutely no logical sense whatsoever, given the context of the patient. The doctors officially concluded that Arcesio Bermudez was suffering from acute lethal radiation poisoning. His physiological breakdown was a completely perfect textbook match for a human being who had been exposed to a massive, concentrated, and highly lethal dose of gamma radiation. But the doctors were completely baffled by this reality. Arcesio was a rural farmer living in the agricultural mountains of Colombia. There were absolutely no nuclear power plants in the entire country. There were no industrial radiology laboratories anywhere near Anolaima, and there was absolutely zero medical radiation equipment within miles of his property. It was completely and physically impossible for him to have contracted acute radiation sickness while standing in a cow pasture. So, the hospital immediately contacted the Colombian Ministry of Health, warning them that there might be a massive undeclared radioactive hazard sitting right in the middle of a farming community. The government immediately dispatched a highly specialized team of investigators out to Arcesio's property. The team arrived at the farmhouse wearing heavy protective gear and carrying highly sensitive Geiger counters and radiation detection equipment. They interviewed Arcesio's family, asking them to point out the exact path Arcesio had taken on the night he first fell ill. The family stood on the porch and pointed down the dirt path, indicating the exact spot near the small hill where the glowing craft had hovered. The investigators clicked their Geiger counters on and began walking slowly down into the pasture. They swept the specialized wands over the dirt path, over the wooden fence posts, and through the tall grass. They spent hours meticulously combing every single inch of the field, specifically focusing on the area where the blue light had flashed. They dug up soil samples, they tested the leaves on the nearby trees, and they swept the hill itself. But the entire time they searched, the Geiger counters remained completely silent. The needles on the dials never twitched above zero. The investigators found absolutely no trace of radioactive isotopes, no contaminated soil, and no irradiated debris. The background radiation levels in the pasture were perfectly aligned with the standard natural limits of the Earth. There was absolutely nothing out there on that farm that could have possibly caused acute radiation sickness. But back at the hospital in Bogota, the reality of the diagnosis was inescapable. Despite the doctors trying every single treatment protocol available in modern medicine, Arcesio's body simply could not regenerate the cells that had been destroyed. His organs completely failed, and he slipped into a deep coma. And just 1 week after he walked out into his pasture with a heavy flashlight to check on a strange light, 54-year-old Arcesio Bermudez passed away in his hospital bed. The official medical reports and the government health records logged his cause of death as being a catastrophic biological failure, perfectly identical to acute radiation poisoning. They documented the blue spots, the hemorrhaging, and the cellular destruction in meticulous detail. And right next to those medical records, the official environmental investigation officially recorded the fact that absolutely no radioactive source was ever located on his property, or anywhere in the surrounding region. Arcesio was just a pragmatic, hard-working man who walked up to a silent, glowing object in his field, got hit by a flash of bright blue light, and died from a lethal dose of radiation that simply did not exist anywhere in his environment. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for it. But while a strange encounter in a rural Colombian field left medical experts grappling with a completely impossible set of facts, a very different kind of impossibility was about to unfold on a busy highway in the United Kingdom. Because just weeks later, a massive police manhunt would completely lock down a motorway to catch a vicious predator, only to realize that they were chasing a ghost. On an overcast afternoon in August of 1973, 20-year-old Jacqueline Ansel Lamb was packing a small canvas duffel bag in the bedroom of her London flat, and she was moving very quickly because she was already running late. Jacqueline was a highly independent young woman who worked as a secretary in the city, but her family lived up north in Manchester. And she took a lot of pride in her ability to navigate the world on her own terms. She didn't own a car, and train tickets were expensive, so she frequently relied on hitchhiking to get across the country. And in 1973, hitchhiking was a completely standard, widely accepted mode of transportation for young people in the United Kingdom. So it was just part of her normal routine. Now Jacqueline grabbed her bag and walked into the small kitchen to say goodbye to her flatmate. She looked at the clock on the wall and sighed. She said, "I am going to miss the party at this rate." Her flatmate looked up from a magazine and told her she should just wait and take the train the next morning. But Jacqueline shook her head and grabbed her coat. She said, "No. I will just catch a ride on the M1. It is much faster." And with that, she walked out the front door, navigated the London Underground, and eventually made her way to the slip road that fed directly onto the M1 motorway, which was the massive high-speed artery connecting London to the north of England. And as Jacqueline stood on the shoulder of the slip road with her thumb extended, a man working at a nearby petrol station happened to glance over at her. He watched her standing there in the wind as several large trucks blew past. And then he saw a light-colored sedan pull over onto the gravel shoulder right in front of Jacqueline. But the petrol station worker noticed something highly specific about this car. As it idled there on the shoulder, the engine was making an incredibly loud, aggressive screeching sound, like a severely damaged fan belt. And the worker also noticed that the rear right taillight of the sedan was completely shattered, exposing the bare white bulb underneath. The worker watched Jacqueline lean down, speak to the driver through the passenger window, and then open the door and climb inside. The door slammed shut, the screeching engine revved, and the light-colored sedan merged onto the M1 and disappeared into the northbound traffic. A few days later, a local farmer was walking through his rural, isolated field in the countryside, miles away from the motorway, and he saw something lying in the tall grass. He walked closer and found the body of Jacqueline Ansel Lamb. She had been manually strangled to death, and her body had been carefully and deliberately posed in the grass, lying flat on her back with her arms neatly folded. The local police were called and they processed the scene, but they found absolutely no physical evidence, no fingerprints, and no weapon. They just had the statement from the petrol station worker about the screeching fan belt and the broken taillight. But without a license plate, tracking down one specific light-colored sedan in the entire country was essentially impossible, so the case quickly stalled. But then, just a few weeks later, in October of 1973, a 23-year-old school teacher named Barbara Mayo was preparing for a very similar journey. Barbara lived in London, but her boyfriend lived up north and she was driving up to see him for the weekend. And unlike Jacqueline, Barbara actually owned her own vehicle, a small, reliable, compact car. So early on a Saturday morning, Barbara packed her bags, got into her car, and merged onto the exact same M1 motorway heading north. For the first couple of hours, the drive was completely smooth. But as Barbara reached a highly rural, isolated stretch of the M1, her engine suddenly began to sputter. She tapped the gas pedal, but the car refused to accelerate. So she guided the dying vehicle over to the hard shoulder, put the car in park, and turned the key. The engine was completely dead. Now, Barbara was stranded on the side of a busy motorway, miles from the nearest emergency telephone. So she did exactly what most people in her situation would do. She locked her car doors, grabbed her heavy coat, stood on the gravel shoulder, and stuck her thumb out to hitch a ride to the nearest service station. And as she stood there, a long-haul truck driver was slowly shifting gears in the left lane, passing right by her. The trucker looked down from his high cab and saw Barbara standing on the shoulder. And he also saw a light-colored sedan pulling over onto the gravel right in front of her. The trucker rolled his window down slightly and he heard the distinct, painfully loud screech of a damaged fan belt coming from the sedan. And as he checked his rearview mirror while driving past, he clearly saw that the rear right taillight of the sedan was totally shattered, exposing a bright white bulb. The trucker watched Barbara open the passenger door and climb inside. Several days later, a group of hikers walking through a dense patch of woods in the northern countryside stumbled upon a grim scene. It was the body of Barbara Mayo, and the crime scene was perfectly identical to the first. She had been strangled to death, and her body had been meticulously posed on the forest floor flat on her back, with her arms neatly folded. When the lead detectives received the coroner's report for Barbara, they immediately linked it to Jacqueline's murder, and they realized they were dealing with a highly organized serial predator who was using the M1 motorway as his own personal hunting ground. They interviewed the truck driver who saw Barbara get picked up, and his description matched the petrol station worker's statement perfectly. It was the exact same light-colored sedan, the exact same screeching fan belt, and the exact same broken taillight. So the police immediately formed a massive assumption. They believed that because the M1 was a closed highway system with specific on-ramps and off-ramps, and because this killer was repeatedly driving a vehicle with highly identifiable mechanical defects, they could simply use their sheer numbers to trap him. They assumed that nobody could possibly hide a screeching, broken car from a coordinated nationwide dragnet. And so the British police launched the single largest physical manhunt in the country's history. They deployed thousands of uniformed officers to the M1 motorway. They set up massive, inescapable roadblocks at every single exit toll booth and service station along the entire route. They completely locked down the highway system. Every single vehicle traveling the M1 was forced to slow down and pull into a checkpoint. and the officers specifically pulled over every single light-colored sedan they saw. They demanded driver's licenses, they checked travel logs, and they physically walked around the vehicles to inspect the taillights and listen to the engine belts. The scale of the operation is completely staggering. The police stop and physically interview 80,000 different drivers. They take thousands of written statements. They follow up on tens of thousands of tips from the public. They comb through mechanical records at every single auto repair shop in the country, looking for anyone who recently fixed a fan belt or a broken rear light. Now the commander of the operation is standing out in the freezing rain at one of the massive roadblocks. He watches as miles and miles of cars inch forward to be inspected by his men. He knows they have a perfect description of the vehicle. He knows they have completely surrounded the exact route the killer uses. He watches his officers check the taillight of a light-colored sedan, clear the driver and wave them through, and the commander waits for the radio call to come in saying they found the screeching engine, but the call never comes. Because despite stopping 80,000 drivers and despite checking every single registered vehicle in the region that remotely matched the profile, the police find absolutely nothing. The light-colored sedan with the screeching engine and the broken taillight simply does not exist in their massive net. It is as if the killer drove right through the heavy police barricades, completely invisible to the thousands of officers standing on the pavement. The massive dragnet completely collapses under its own weight, yielding not a single viable suspect. And decades later, in the early 2000s, forensic scientists managed to extract a microscopic DNA profile from the clothing left at the crime scenes. They run the genetic markers through the massive modern national database, fully expecting to finally put a name to the phantom driver. But the computer returns 0 matches. The predator who hunted young women on the British motorways simply vanished into the highway mist, completely evading the largest manhunt in history. The cases of Jacqueline and Barbara remain entirely unsolved, and to this day they do not have an explanation for it. But while a massive police dragnet failed to find a very real killer hiding on a British highway, a completely different kind of illusion was being created in an American office building. Because across the ocean, corporate executives were busy inventing thousands of entirely fake people just so they could open up a bottle of liquor and roll the dice to decide which one of them had to die. On a Friday afternoon in early 1973, a 36-year-old executive named Ronald Seacrest was standing by the massive windows of his office, and he was looking out over the sprawling skyline of Los Angeles, California. Ronald was a senior officer at the Equity Funding Corporation of America, and at that time, working for Equity Funding was essentially like working for a corporate rock band. The company was an absolute juggernaut in the financial sector. They aggressively sold mutual funds and life insurance policies to thousands of middle-class Americans. And they were so incredibly successful at it that they were widely considered to be the absolute darling of Wall Street. So for Ronald, landing a job in this specific building was a massive point of personal pride. He was a highly ambitious guy who had spent years grinding his way up through the competitive insurance industry. He was used to long hours and incredibly demanding bosses, but Equity Funding was completely different from any other firm he had ever worked for. The corporate culture here was fueled by sheer, unadulterated growth. The executives wore expensive, custom-tailored suits and drove brand-new, imported luxury cars, and Ronald loved every single second of it. He loved the deep respect that he received whenever he handed his embossed business card to someone at a dinner party. He loved watching the company's stock price climb higher on the ticker tape every single week. But despite all of the external success and the immense wealth that was flowing through the building, Ronald had slowly started to notice a very distinct, almost paranoid undercurrent running through the headquarters. And it all seemed to originate from one highly secretive division located on the upper floors of the building. Internally, this division was simply referred to as the Special Projects Department. Now, in a massive corporation, having compartmentalized departments was completely standard. But the level of secrecy surrounding special projects bordered on the extreme. The executives who ran it completely refused to mingle with the rest of the staff in the cafeteria. They kept their heavy office doors firmly deadbolted from the inside, and they only communicated with the rest of the firm through tightly sealed internal memos. And to understand why this department even existed, you have to understand exactly how equity funding made its money. Normally, when a life insurance company writes a massive new policy for a healthy customer, the company takes on an enormous amount of long-term financial risk. Because if that customer dies, the very next day, the company is suddenly on the hook to pay out a massive death benefit. So to mitigate this risk, the insurance company will routinely sell these policies to other much larger financial institutions. And this is a very common industry practice known as reinsurance. The original company gets a fast infusion of cash from the sale, and the larger reinsurer takes on the statistical long-term risk of the person actually dying. And over the past few years, equity funding had been selling an absolutely unprecedented astronomical volume of these policies to major reinsurers all across the country. Because Ronald was a senior administrative officer, his daily duties occasionally required him to handle the physical paperwork that was generated by the Special Projects Department. And whenever he sat at his mahogany desk and reviewed these specific life insurance files, he noticed something highly unusual about the physical folders themselves. The medical records inside them were absolutely pristine. Now, Ronald had been in the insurance game for a very long time, and he knew exactly what a standard medical file looked like. Real files were always an absolute mess. They would have deeply crinkled edges, hasty doctor's signatures, smudged typewriter ink, and brown coffee stains from being passed around busy medical clinics. But the files coming out of the Special Projects Department had absolutely none of that. They were just perfectly aligned, flawlessly typed, crisp white pages with incredibly neat signatures. But Ronald was a loyal company man, and he was not eager to disrupt the massive success of his employer. So he provided himself with a very logical, reasonable explanation for this strange anomaly. He simply assumed that the Special Projects Department had incredibly strict administrative standards. He figured that they were employing a massive team of secretaries to meticulously retype every single medical document. He assumed they were doing this just to make the company look highly professional and organized for the outside government auditors. And so Ronald simply closed the pristine folders, placed them back into his filing cabinet, and went right back to his own daily work, completely ignoring the massive red flags that were staring him right in the face. But a few weeks later, on a Friday evening in early April of 1973, Ronald's perspective on the company was completely and permanently shattered. He had stayed at the office very late that evening to finish compiling some dense quarterly financial reports. By 8:30 at night, the massive corporate headquarters was almost entirely empty. The receptionists had all gone home. The main overhead lights were dimmed, and the sprawling trading floor was completely silent. But as Ronald finally packed his briefcase and walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the elevators, he stopped, because he could hear a very strange rhythmic sound echoing down the stairwell from the upper floors. It was the distinct sound of loud, booming music, overlapping cheering, and the sharp clinking of heavy glass bottles. Ronald was highly confused because he knew for a fact that there were no official corporate events scheduled for that evening. He gripped the handle of his briefcase and walked over to the stairwell. He climbed the concrete steps up to the restricted floor where the Special Projects Department was located. And as he got closer to the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, the noise grew incredibly loud. It sounded exactly like a massive out-of-control frat party was taking place right in the middle of a highly regulated Wall Street financial institution. So Ronald reaches out, turns the brass knob, and pushes the heavy door open. And when he steps inside, he is completely taken aback by the sheer chaos of the room. There are dozens of well-dressed corporate executives, junior analysts, and filing clerks packed into the main office space. The men have their expensive silk ties completely loosened, and the women have kicked their high heels off under the desks. They are drinking expensive whiskey straight out of paper cups, blowing thick clouds of cigar smoke into the air and laughing hysterically. And right in the absolute center of the room, several of the highest-ranking senior vice presidents are gathered closely around a massive, polished mahogany conference table. And this table is completely covered in towering thick stacks of dot matrix computer printouts. Ronald walks slowly into the room, totally bewildered by the chaotic scene playing out in front of him. A young filing clerk accidentally bumps into his shoulder holding a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon. "What exactly are we celebrating?" Ronald asks, looking around the messy room. The clerk smiles widely, totally unfazed, and hands Ronald an empty paper cup. "It is settling day," the clerk says, loudly over the music. Ronald furrows his brow in complete confusion. Who is settling? "The department," the clerk replies, casually pointing his bottle toward the massive conference table. "We are choosing the payouts." Ronald looks over at the conference table just as one of the senior vice presidents, a man wearing a very expensive tailored suit, picks up a pair of bright red casino dice. The entire room suddenly goes quiet for a split second, and then everyone starts cheering and clapping their hands in a loud rhythmic pattern. The vice president shakes the red dice in his cupped hand, smiles at the crowd, and aggressively rolls them right across the massive stacks of computer printouts. The dice bounce heavily over the paper clicked together, and finally come to a stop near the edge of the table. The vice president leans over, looks closely at the numbers facing up, and then uses his index finger to drag down the incredibly long list of names printed on the page. He stops at a specific line on the paper and taps it heavily with his finger. "All right," the vice president shouts enthusiastically over the loud, booming music. "We have a winner for the week. John Doe, from a rural town in Wisconsin. Massive fatal heart attack at age 42. The entire room immediately erupts into deafening cheers and applause. A junior clerk sitting at a nearby desk immediately runs over to a large metal filing cabinet, grabs a pristine manila folder, and slams a heavy red rubber stamp right onto the front cover that reads, "Approved for immediate payout." Ronald stands completely frozen near the doorway with his empty paper cup. He stares directly at the red stamp on that folder. And in that exact fraction of a second, the complete and total absurdity of the situation finally clicks in his brain. These executives are not processing legitimate life insurance claims for grieving families. They are completely and totally inventing them. And they are doing it because the thousands of names on those thick computer printouts are not real. They are entirely fake phantom people. To artificially inflate their corporate stock price and generate massive amounts of illegal cash, the top executives at Equity Funding had simply decided to invent fake customers out of thin air. Over the course of several years, they had systematically created over 64,000 entirely non-existent people. They assigned them fake names, fake addresses, and fake families. Then they wrote highly lucrative life insurance policies for these phantom citizens, and they sold those premium rights to massive reinsurers for cold, hard Wall Street cash. But the executives quickly realized they had a massive problem. To make this colossal web of fake people look completely legitimate to the outside government auditors, the company had to periodically fake their deaths. They needed to systematically kill a few of them off on paper, to actually collect the massive death benefits from the reinsurers and balance their complicated internal accounting books. And that was exactly why those medical records Ronald had reviewed weeks earlier were so incredibly pristine and flawless. Those files had never been inside a real chaotic doctor's office. They had never been touched by a real nurse or stained by spilled coffee. They had been entirely forged and meticulously typed up right there in the special projects room. They were created entirely by young corporate clerks who were simply making up fake blood pressure readings and fake tragic medical histories for people who simply did not exist. But the most absurd aspect of the entire scheme was not the financial theft. It was the absolute psychological detachment of the people running it. The massive fraud had been going on for so many years that the corporate staff had become completely and totally desensitized to the fact that they were executing a multi-billion-dollar federal crime. They had turned the massive, highly illegal operation into a literal office game. To decide which of their fake customers needed to die to balance the books, they routinely held these absurd office death parties. They would drink heavy amounts of expensive liquor, smoke cigars, and actually roll casino dice on the conference table to randomly select which of their fake phantom people would suffer a fake tragic accident that week. They would openly laugh and joke with each other about whether a fake person should die in a car crash or succumb to a sudden illness. They were happily stamping the forged death certificates while the music blared in the background. Ronald was completely and utterly disgusted by the sheer, unadulterated corporate greed and the absolute surreal nature of the party taking place in front of him. He did not say another word to the clerk. He simply set his empty paper cup down on a nearby desk, turned around, and walked right out of the building into the cool Los Angeles night. And very shortly after this strange incident, Ronald was actually quietly fired from the company during a routine round of corporate downsizing. But he did not just walk away and keep his mouth shut. He immediately contacted a prominent Wall Street insurance analyst named Raymond Dirks, and he laid out the entire completely absurd multi-billion-dollar scheme in explicit detail. And so in April of 1973, the massive $2 billion scam was officially exposed to the public and the federal authorities. The Equity Funding Corporation of America, which had been the absolute shining star of Wall Street, collapsed virtually overnight in what became one of the largest and most ridiculous corporate frauds in American history. The company was completely dismantled, and several of the top executives who had been laughing, drinking, and rolling dice in that room were convicted of massive fraud and sent directly to prison. But while corporate fraudsters in Los Angeles were busy throwing absurd office parties to kill off thousands of completely imaginary people, a very real and physical empty grave was quietly waiting to be discovered, alongside a rural highway. In New Zealand,